Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Showrunner Whisperer. This is your podcast where we take you inside the minds of television showrunners and what goes into running a TV show in today's television landscape. I'm your host, Andy B. As always, first of all, if you're a new listener, welcome back. Welcome to the show. Happy to have you. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. Happy to see all of you. We are in the midst of June already. The year is flying by, y'all. And lots of things are happening. So we're entering the summer season. So I hope everyone is doing well. And first of all, I want to say, as always, thank you so much for all the support and love and good feedback on the last couple episodes we've had. We had a lot of interviews. For the Showrunner Whisperer. A lot of we're just rolling it out, and we're still recording new episodes as we speak. So again, massive thank you. Again, if you want to support the podcast, you can always go to Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts at, subscribe, and also leave a 5-star review and let us know what you think about the show, what you think about our guests, what we can do to improve the podcast, and so much more, because that's a great way to support the show for free, and also it helps more viewers and listeners find the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, etc., etc. But so yeah, if you could just do that, that would be a huge favor for me. And but yeah, we have another episode, y'all. We have another episode. We're still rolling on episode 7 this week. We have Bob Berens, who is one of the showrunners of Kung Fu, which was it was a not short lived. It lasted for 3 seasons on the CW, and it was a very popular show on the CW, especially for the before all of the things that happened with the CW as we know it now. So throughout this interview, we chat about where he got his start in Hollywood and how he went through a different couple of gigs before he got to the position that he was through Kung Fu. And there, it was he was one of my first guests, actually, like one of the earliest guests I had. So we recorded this all the way back in, I believe this was January. Like, again, this because there was a lot of people I had talked to before, like that I wanted to have on before the strike happened. And then once the strike was over was when we were able to like really start making things happen. But yeah, we chatted back in. I'm actually pulling this up right now. It was in January. We chatted in January, and anyway, he was so fun to talk to, and I can't wait for you guys to hear his story and how he got to this position with Kung Fu. So I'm gonna stop talking and let you guys enjoy my chat with Bob Berens, and I will see you at the very end. Enjoy. One of the things I've asked all of my guests that have been coming on, is that because we're dealing, we're coming off, off the big writer strike from last year. So I kind of just want to get check in with you first and kind of see where you're at right now today. How that experience was for you going through 100+ days of picketing and following these studios, talking about the strike and so on. So where are you at today with it?
I won't deny it was a rough year in many ways, and I think it was a necessary battle. I was very supportive of the strike and very supportive of our negotiating committee and the guild. But it's a long time for the industry to freeze. So it was a challenging year in a lot of ways, and I think personally, I've been working pretty continuously for about 12 years in the industry, and showrunning took a lot out of me. I mean, it's a very demanding job, and I definitely felt kind of a sense of, well, the timing kind of lines up nicely for me, in that I needed a break, and it was sort of hard to take a break for myself. And then within, a month or two, the experience of kind of going from 60 to 0 that hard, that handbrake, lurch into inactivity and not writing, or at least not writing in any sort of, writing for production sense, was definitely whiplashy, and it was a challenging year in a lot of ways. So I'm looking forward to, as things are getting back, moving again. I'm ready and recovered, and more than recovered, to sort of throw my hat back in the ring and get working again. So yeah, that's how it's been for me.
Throughout these couple of months, as this was going on, we saw really a lot, like with the trades of reporting from what's the perspective of the studio and so on, including like how there was that one executive that was hoping to drag this out until people would start losing their homes and stuff. Like, was that something that helped drive you and kind of like, oh, we're not going to be treated like this. We don't go down that easily.
I mean, yeah, certainly, any statements like that certainly lit a fire under all of us. Sort of got us into war mode a little bit. I think for personally, as someone who's worked continuously for 12 years, and we can get into the ways in which, I worked for that, and the ways in which I was very lucky and very, very fortunate to have that experience across the past, decade. It's definitely a case where I'm in a place, I was personally in a place of relative security, and really, like, the battle for me, as I understood it, and, was for the next generation, and as well as people who didn't have the same experience and didn't have sort of the same financial cushion that I had as a result of that. Like, there's so much insecurity in this industry. There's so much, not working is a full-time job, because lining up the next job, it takes a ton of effort and a ton of free labor. And so knowing that I was fighting for everyone else, that's sort of what lit the fire under me. Because personally, as I was saying earlier, like, my experience was like, it's a good time for a break. I think I needed to focus on my health and focus on getting sleep for a little while, which was good for me. But just thinking about sort of, doing it for everyone, for the next generation, doing it for other writers who didn't have that security. And yeah, so that's really what got me going. And it's also, I'm very susceptible to the agitprop and rhetoric of our negotiating committee and Chris Kaiser, our friends on the negotiating committee, and they got me whipped up. Yeah, I found leadership very inspiring through that, even though it was a very scary time.
Well, something I ask all of my guests who come on is, what is your definition of a showrunner?
I mean, I guess distilled to at least one of its essences, it's where the buck stops. The expression "the buck stops here." In terms of, there's so many people involved in a show, from the studio and network and producers, to department heads, to crew, to cast, to the whole writing staff. There are a lot of people responsible for things, and things are occurring outside of your purview as the showrunner. Great things and bad, and things are going awry at the same time. And like, ultimately, in most cases, like, the responsibility for how things are going it really lands. You're the focal point, you're the fulcrum as the showrunner. And that means being responsible for the running of the whole machine. And everyone has a ton of responsibility in all their various roles, but really, like, you have both the privilege and the great stress of being responsible for things moving well and running well. And that goes out, the impact of that is felt in a bunch of different directions. And so it's a heavy burden in that sense. It's also like the absolute greatest creative privilege and joy in the world, because you get to be sort of the eye of the storm, where in virtually every direction, in terms of the workflow, both like hierarchically below and above you, people are doing great work, and people are invested in something. And it's, you are sort of you are the one who's both responsible for and making final decisions about where money's going. What things are we cutting? What things are we saving money for? What is the creative narrative direction of the show that we're going with? Out of all of the ideas being generated by the writers, out of all the ideas being generated by cast, or even bubbling up from crew members who have a crazy idea, or have some aspect of their own talent or ability that they're like, oh, look, this is a skill I have, or we could do something like this, or there's this great location that we haven't used yet up in Vancouver. And you're kind of the filter for all of that talent and energy, in terms of ultimately deciding, like, yes, we're going to pursue this, and no, we're not. So that was a long-winded answer, but
No,
uh,
that's okay. So, if we had to go, if someone had to pick up your, because I'm a big comic book fan, so I speak always in comic books. But if someone had to pick up your issue one of your origin story of how you got into the world of writing, what would that story look like?
ooh, I mean, I'd want to shout out too many things. I would say, um, I actually grew up. My younger brother was a year younger than I was. We were born on the same day, a year apart, so we're sort of like quasi twins. Um, and as like a 3 and 4 year old, I was a little. I think the word that was used at the time was slow. Slow to read, slow to learn, basic physical abilities like tying shoes. I don't think I learned how to ride a bike till I was like 7. That might even be generous. And even with reading, I was slow. Like I ended up in the same grade as my brother in nursery and pre-K and kindergarten. And at a certain point, I know this is all hindsight. I knew that he was getting ahead of me and sort of in reading even. And I don't think it was spurred by competitiveness, but there was just a moment where reading clicked and I became obsessed and just started gobbling and gobbling. And I've always been a person of like lopsided ability in that as a child. Like I became very precocious in just that one area and virtually no others. Um, and it was reading, it was that sense of progression of reading of like, this is what adults do, or this is what the older kids do. And like, oh, if I read this, then I can read this. And this book is even bigger and it's like about more adult characters or whatever. So I was always kind of in that sense ambitious of climbing upwards. And I mean, I know that the first book series that I became completely enraptured by was Beverly Cleary's Ramona books. And I identified her. Even more than identifying with her, I found her mischief hilarious. And I just remember like cackling over those books and climbing upwards with them. So that was sort of very foundational to me. As well, Beverly Cleary wrote a couple books about, or at least one book about the relationship between a young person and the writer of books. I think it was called Dear Mr. Crenshaw or Henshaw. And and I read also a biography of Beverly Cleary, when I was really young. That gave me an idea of the writer as a thing you can be. So I was very interested in that and was something I was interested in pursuing. But I could rattle off a bunch. I mean, I was a huge Stephen King fan growing up. Comics as well, I think, were pretty formative, particularly the Claremont run of X-Men. So
Those are very classic.
yeah.
And then how did your writing career get kicked off with? Like what? Because I know you began. Was it Ringer that you started with first?
Ringer was the beginning of my sort of Hollywood career. Where do I start? I was a lit major at undergrad. Thought I was going to be a literary novelist. I think this is a fairly common progression for some TV writers, certainly in sort of like the pre-Golden Age era when like TV was sort of perceived as a step down. Maybe it's like, oh no, I'm going to write great literary novels. Was for a while I was good at it. I wrote pretty good short stories, and then I tackled a novel and got completely lost in it and had like a 500-page draft that I just did not know how to tame, and was starting to sort of doubt that was really the right form for me. And in fact, well, I guess I'll go on at some length. I had a friend, an actor friend of mine, who read my manuscript or a chunk of my manuscript, and he said he didn't think I had it. So he made a comment, that punctured some of my literary ego and my perception that was the right medium for me. And that was really hurtful. And I processed it for a good long while. And I think it was actually really good advice. And it was from a friend who could really see me more clearly than I could see myself, that I hadn't found my medium yet. And at a certain point in I was working at a left-wing magazine in New York City. I abandoned my manuscript. Had certainly was watching a lot of TV at the time, in addition to reading a lot of books. And I had an idea, an idea for this should be a TV show. This would be the greatest TV show ever in my head. And I wrote a pilot and didn't know what it meant. Really thought like, oh, this pilot will just be so good that someone's going to, as soon as someone reads it, they're going to be like throwing money at it. And I'm going to be a showrunner at age 25 before I had any idea what a showrunner even really was. Before I had any idea really what TV production was. And that experience was so creatively satisfying independently of, nothing came of it. I think I got like a manager for a little while off of it, but that, sort of tough-headed friend, like read it and he's like, this is it. Like this is what you should be doing. So he was right in the end, and I spec'd, wrote a ton of spec scripts, submitted to a few festival, programs, got shortlisted at the Warner Brothers program off of, I believe, an L-word spec script. And there was enough sort of positive reinforcement, even though I didn't get in and I was still living in New York, that I kept going with it. And at a certain point, I got an opportunity to start writing webisodes and then half-hour cartoon scripts for a small company in New York that made content for like Nicktoons and Nickelodeon and stuff like that, and Cartoon Network. And none of those shows ever really hit in any zeitgeisty way, and a lot of them were burned off sort of late at night. But it was a really great training ground to just write script after script after script, and to work alongside a lot of writers who were, I was already in my late 20s, but these were early 20-somethings, most of whom were, Harvard kids who were really just a year or two away from writing for SNL and 30 Rock. And they all had kind of that half-hour comedy training. So I learned a lot about TV writing, just, in sort of the bush leagues there. Yeah, I'm going on, but
No, that's what this is for. We want to get to know you better.
And so that was the process, and that was great too, because I made, not a tremendous living, but a decent living off of writing for a couple of years doing that, and that was really incredible. But at a certain point, I knew I had to, that I wasn't setting out to write for comedy or variety. Like I really had to be on the West Coast. So I moved out here and beat the bushes for a few years. I was actually temping at Warner Brothers in HR. Item like doing data entry for like I-9s and W-2s for Jennifer Aniston, a bunch of celebrities. I saw their social security numbers, didn't write them down because I'm a good boy. But yeah, and I just kept doing that, and eventually I got repped off of a pilot that my agency thought they had a chance of selling, and then it didn't sell, and I was devastated. And that I think it was that year, maybe a year later, I was up for a staff writer position on a show, and they ended up not having money in the budget for a staff writer or for a second staff writer. And they're like, I got a call from the showrunners, and they're like, look, will you please come on as writer's assistant? We'll guarantee you a script, which is an incredible sort of first writer's assistant gig. I've been trying to get a writer's assistant job, and I sucked at it, / it's a very competitive job to get. So I was like, absolutely. And the fact that I had a guaranteed script, it was a complete no-brainer. I was thrilled. So I got onto Ringer, and that was really the beginning of my entire career. It all flowed from Nicole Snyder and Eric Carmelo sort of taking a shot on me.
Just because I'm such a huge fan of her. What was it like writing for Sarah Michelle Gellar?
Oh, very intimidating, because I was a huge, huge Buffy fan. In terms of the shows that made me want to write for television, Buffy was certainly number one, up there, if not just number one. I think it was the intense serialization that Buffy really was doing ahead of any other, network show, that I was like, oh, a TV show can engage with continuity across cast, and not just main cast, but supporting characters. Their stories are being, told and evolved from every episode to every episode. It wasn't rinse, lather, repeat, as so much television had been up until that point. And to me, that was very exciting. And to me, it also connected in my mind to sort of like what I'd loved so much about the Claremont run, and and comic books, and as a kid, it was that sense of like, it's not just what's going to happen to Scott and Jean. It's like what's going to happen to Aurora, and what's going to happen to Kitty Pryde and Colossus, like the sort of soap operas and those sort of sub threads. So Buffy was huge, huge for me. And I was also walking onto a show, I was in the room, I was, doing my job as a writer's assistant. But then when I was up at bat and I was writing, episodes, I was producing too. And I have to say, like, in terms of writers walking onto a set and like producing their episodes, I'm like almost shocked that I was allowed to do it, because I don't think anyone has ever been as green as I was. And maybe that's narcissistic. But I truly did not know what I was doing. And I could only speak just from my knowledge of the script and the material and the stories from having been in the room. So yes, it was very intimidating. And I think that Sarah could kind of smell the fanboy on me. Like, I think she from how she looked at me, but ultimately we got along, and it was a great thrill. Also, I mean, watching her work was a huge education in and of itself, because you could really see, one of the best TV actresses who's to ever do it, like really deliver and really know exactly what she's doing when she walks onto the set, in terms of, this is the performance I'm going to give you in this take, and then when we get tighter, this is when I'm going to spend, the last of my emotional energy to really push it, because this is most likely where we're going to be for, when we land this beat. We're going to be in the close. Like, she just understands it. And it's one of those things, like working with the Supernatural guys too. It's a similar thing where you're watching an actor who understands not just the craft of acting, which they, have completely nailed, but the specific craft of TV acting, and just are operating at such a high skill level when they do it. So it was ultimately like a very, very rewarding and educational experience. And also felt sort of fated, because it was like, wait, how is my first job, writing for Sarah Michelle Gellar of all people? It was kind of incredible.
No, like when you were talking about that she could almost smell the fanboy in you, I felt that's what she did with me, because I interviewed her actually around this time last year for her new Wolfpack show, and like again, it's these like virtual junkets, you only have like certain amount of minutes, so like I had to like really like bite my lip. I think she could like tell that I was like, oh my god, it's Buffy Summers. Like, I'm talking to Buffy Summers. So but even her ringer, didn't go past. It didn't go beyond season 1. You've been at the CW for a long time now, because then Supernatural happened. How did the transition from ringer to Supernatural happen for you?
That was a case where, I wrote 3 episodes of the show. I felt like I was really well positioned. Like, I felt like I'd proven my worth to everyone I was on staff with. But when the show didn't go for another season, virtually everyone else moved on to other shows within, a few months, in the next cycle. And I was unemployed for a year. And after, that was a really hard year. It was sort of like this year from here right now, where it was like going from 60 to 0 and just being like, oh my God, am I ever getting, another job? Am I ever going to get the chance to do this again? And it was during that time, Eric and Nicole, the creators of Ringer, were developing a pilot, and they wanted to sort of convene a room, just like Friends, for like a day of kind of pitching on the Bible, kind of like a Friends only mini room kind of situation, just for an evening. And they brought pizza and drinks and stuff, and we all met and just pitched on their pilot for a few hours, and it was super fun. I didn't feel like I distinguished myself, to any exceptional degree. But a few months later, Andrew Dabb, who was another writer in the room, he had known Eric and Nicole from their first stint on Supernatural, reached out to me and said, we're looking for staff writers, and you impressed me in the room that day. So I had no idea I'd made any kind of impression, but it was enough for him to sort of go to bat for me and had me read by Jeremy Carver and Bob Singer at Supernatural, and try to get that job, and in the end I did. So that it was definitely, it all flows from that first job for sure. It really came from the Ringer folks.
Would you say that because you worked on that for several years, so so you got to really be working under Jeremy and was it Rob or Bob? You said
there's Bob Singer, who's been on the show since the first season, and then Jeremy Carver was showrunning at that point. So I worked under Jeremy as showrunner for a handful of years, and then ultimately for Andrew for the rest of the show's run.
How did they influenced you as showrunners for before you became one? Like, what were great lessons that you learned from them during your time on Supernatural?
It's so interesting because Supernatural is run very differently. Was run very differently from most shows, not all shows, but most shows. So it's something that Supernatural alums sort of talk about, like when you that a lot of Supernatural writers end up as showrunners. Like it's a higher rate, or at least we perceive it to be the case. And it's very interesting because the job of showrunning on Supernatural and the job of being a writer on Supernatural are in some ways unique from most other certainly genre television, because the writers at Supernatural convene at the beginning of the season and pitch to some tent poles laid out by the showrunner. But ultimately, a lot of decision making occurs sort of independently of the writing staff, and writers. There's a lot more independent study on Supernatural, where your episodes are your episodes to develop in isolation and then pitch to the boss sort of solo. Like you're not breaking your own episodes with the entirety of the writing staff and the showrunner in and out of the room. It's very much you get some parameters and then you break and pitch. So the workflow there is very specific. And it's funny because like I would say like really what I was learning from them was not really witnessing their decision making and them operating in their showrunning capacity, because a lot of that was sort of private actually. It was more learning from them as writers, I think. I think really like also Supernatural, we did not produce on that show. So if you wanted to spend time on set, if you wanted to, dip your toes into production, you would actually pay your own way to go up there for a couple days, a season or even a whole episode. But it was all there was a division there. So
Sorry, the reason I got so surprised because I know a lot of Warner shows would send out their writers. So this is the first time I've actually heard that Supernatural didn't follow that trend. So I didn't know because because I have a lot of friends on CW shows that they were like it was almost like part of their job of like you go up to set at least once a year for your episode. But with Supernatural as big as it was, like I figured that this was of course the case. But that's interesting.
Yeah, no, it's very different in that sense. And I mean, virtually everyone did go up and spend some time on set, but there was a little bit more of a division between production and the writing staff, and that's what's so interesting about sort of how many showrunners have come out of the show, because certain aspects of professional training and development like did not occur in terms of. But there were benefits. I mean, if not benefits to that model, at least you do have to train, like the training of not having, there's a camaraderie and support that comes from being in the room every day, everyone working, rowing in the same direction as a group. The kind of independent study model, the sort of isolation of, you may convene with the writers and discuss stuff with them, but then, for a period of time, you're developing that episode independently, basically for an audience of, Bob and Jeremy or Bob and Andrew. And I do think that's its own kind of training in terms of the anxiety of it and the isolation, the intensity of it. Perhaps it had sort of a benefit in terms of being a showrunner. I don't know. But yeah, it's a very different situation. I've heard it sometimes referred to as the Dick Wolf model, because Law and Order is run in a sort of similar fashion. And I think some of the other procedurals are done that way. And that's also, the Supernatural has that kind of mythology procedural model where, it's, 2 to 3 episodes of sort of standalone episodes that are lightly serialized, followed by 1 or 2 episodes that are more sort of myth heavy and that involve more sort of collaboration with the whole writing staff to sort of keep narrative continuity going.
What do you have a personal favorite season of that you got to work on where you felt like, where you're seeing your growth, you're seeing your impact, you're seeing like how it's connecting with viewers and so on? Because Supernatural was really one of those shows that really, because Twitter was still like, I think by 2010 still like very new, And but you guys were on for so long that Supernatural really became part of that social media spectrum. So like, do you have a personal favorite season?
Oh, of the like from before my time, or
No, that you got to work on, that you felt like this was the year where I grew so much, I learned so much, and you felt like you had a really good flow.
I would say, I mean, I would say across the run of the show, my impact and influence on the show grew in some ways, you know, and I worked very closely with Andrew on the last few seasons, along with Meredith Glenn, who became sort of my codependent fellow writer, and we, you know, bounced every idea and every page we wrote, you know, off of each other. But so in terms of my impact on the show, it probably did grow and arc up across my time there. But I would say my first season was the most thrilling to me. I mean, because partly because I wasn't writing myth episodes. I think the first season I got to write standalone episodes where I was really crafting beginning, middle, and ends. And of the 3 episodes, actually, it was my mythiest, as we say, episode that I was least happy with. But getting to tell contained stories where I was generating the idea, or even if it was an idea that was brought to me by other writers or producers, I got to really make it mine in the process of incubating it and developing it. And then I got to see it, you know, made. And not only did I get to see, you know, Jared and Jensen and Misha, you know, sort of knock, you know, these stories out of the park. I also got, you know, the intoxicating experience of seeing how much this show meant to people via social media, via Twitter, you know, and it's like, you know, it's like renting a car and they give you a Cadillac. Like, you're like, oh shit, you know. It was a very intense experience to see just, you know, I think one of the reasons why we write, one of the reasons why creative people, you know, do anything is to inspire strong emotion in people, right? And you know, you want to make people cry, you want to make them think, you want, you know, to stir them up, you even make them angry sometimes. And when you are behind the wheel of a show that people care about as much as they cared about Supernatural, and where they have such an intense emotional response, it's like, it kind of feels like cheating because, you know, you're finding new ways to hurt Sam, Dean, and Castiel, really. And, you know, every arrow you fling in their direction, like, you know, A, it's being communicated by these incredibly skilled actors, and B, the audience is already so emotionally invested in them that they're very primed to have an intense emotional response. So that was the most, like, you know, my first year there was the most exciting in that sense, for sure.
I you know, I was kind of in and out of Supernatural, but the one of the things that I was personally looking forward to that no, sadly didn't go off was Wayward Sisters. And if you're okay talking about it a little bit, because that was that going to be the first, if that show had gone forward, that was going to be what you became a co-showrunner for, right?
Yes, that was the plan, for sure. That was the hope. That was a really great experience, from beginning to end, even though it was disappointing the show didn't get picked up. It was a really, really long process. You know, I would say, like, it was a case where a kind of IP within the Supernatural universe emerged in ways that was at certain points very deliberate and at certain points completely sort of accidental, you know. I think it all really starts with Jodie Mills and Kim Rhodes' performance, and her becoming, over several seasons, just one of the best of a large stable of wonderful recurring characters and actors. And there was just an emotional quality to her backstory, and an emotional quality to this relationship she had with Alex off of the episode I was proudest of, you know, from my first season on the show. But there was also the Claire of it all, which was occurring in other writers' episodes, and it took on a life of its own. I mean, to the personally, as a writer, I wanted to write for Kim again. I wanted to write for Kat again. I wanted to sort of explore that dynamic of that mother-daughter relationship. But simultaneous with that sort of goal of, like, I want to keep this continuity going with these characters in this story. You know, you also had a kind of fandom idea sort of cohere around the idea of this show as Wayward Sisters. And it took a really long time for our intentions and the fandom sort of, wish casting for this show to align and to get to a place where we were able to do a planted spinoff. But I mean, to talk out of school a bit, it was probably like 2 years of trying to get sort of the studio network to even let us take that chance,
Because this was right after Bloodline, right?
Yeah. I think, Bloodline was about the same time as that first Jodie Alex episode. And so it was running, it took about 2 seasons. And, it was very stop and go. And there was a moment where there may have been like an opening on the CW's roster for the following year. So sort of independently of the network, Andrew and I sort of broke away and just sort of like wrote like a full, not planted spinoff, but like a full pilot version of Wayward Sisters. And to this day, I still think that was the more robust approach for the show. But when it comes down to sort of dollars and cents, and like there was a push to kind of do it as a planted spinoff because the studio saves money. There's less risk because worst case scenario, you just have another episode of the show, and you're spending half as much money. So our show was going up against full pilots with much larger budgets. I'd also say that creatively, we approached it. We had just written a full independent pilot for the show that didn't end up going. And so when it was our turn to do it again, I think we got a little invested in how do we do this in a way where it ties into the main, show. How do we make this sort of an experiment in serialization across the run of the season? And not exclusively focused on how do we make the best possible pilot we can make. So creatively, it was really, really fun to kind of, feather in the elements that led up to the planted spinoff. But I do think that approach was not as strong, in terms of making the case for the show as a series, as if we had just done a solo pilot. But it was an incredible experience and the chance to kind of build out the world of those characters, introduce some new characters, cast the show. And as I said before, you don't get to produce that much on Supernatural, but because we were doing a planted spinoff and because we were doing a serialized planted spinoff where, in several episodes leading up to it, the mid-season finale and then the planted spinoff, as well as episode 3 of that season that introduced the character of Patience, I got to spend I may have Eric Kripke might kill me if I say this and I'm wrong, and I'm actually almost certainly wrong, but it became like a joke that I was spending enough time with the crew that someone were like, I think you've been here more days total than any writer on the show has ever been, because it ended up being I spent 5 or 6 weeks up there and got to really produce in a way that you don't typically get to do on the show. So that was definitely a great education for me.
What's interesting to me is that because we're talking about franchises now on the CW, where because this was during the decade when for the younger generation that's listening to this, this was when the Arrowverse was really around, and you would think there's something as big as Supernatural that they were like how are there not already like 2 or 3 spin-offs already and so on. Because I remember I watched Wayward Sisters, and it's been a hot minute, but I remember thinking like, how, like I'm like looking at Mark Pedowitz and I'm like, how did you not go forward with this? And then years later, we had the Winchesters as the first, official spinoff. Like, to this day, like, are you still kind of a little bit perplexed of like, how didn't we go forward with this, or what? Where do you stand on it at this point?
I don't carry any. I metabolized my disappointment and regret about it for sure, as maybe just as a matter of mental health. And I in some ways I can't even really speak to, like, I sort of have come to understand sort of the politics of that decision and why it didn't go. I think, in some case there was a sense, this is only a partial answer, but in some sense too, there was a sense in which the property was rogue in a way, in that, the development process in television typically involves a lot of studio network development. And in that process, you get allies and everyone from covering execs all the way up to president of the network get a feeling of like I'm an author of this project. This project belongs to me, and so there's a rooting interest in it. And there's a sense in which Supernatural was a little bit the redheaded stepchild of the network. I mean, on the one hand, doing solid numbers for them was an asset that they were very committed to and love, but also a sense in which the development of the show was so deep already in the past at that point, and even there was some autonomy in the development of Wayward Sisters. I mean, studio was involved, network was involved, but there was a sense in which it belonged more to us than to them, in a way that maybe there wasn't as deep a loyalty to that show going, at the level of the decision makers than there would have been had it been a more traditional pilot.
Before I get to your latest adventure, because I'm a huge Doom Patrol fan, and I kind of also want to pick your brain on your time on that show, because then that's when you got to work with Jeremy again. How did that little chapter happen?
It was a case where I don't remember if I was between my deal or not at Supernatural. So I was up for other things. I was considering maybe leaving the show or getting a job on another show. It may have been simultaneous with that, so a conversation sort of opened up. I know that I believe one of their writers on Doom Patrol had to leave mid-season. So I think that they had broken maybe the first 5 episodes of the show. And they were losing someone in the room, and Jeremy wanted someone to come in and kind of fill out and round out the room. And we had worked really well together. I learned a lot from him on Supernatural, and he reached out. And somehow we managed to negotiate it so I could work on both shows at the same time. So I was kind of full-time on each show. I think I was 4 days a week on Doom Patrol, and it was a real luxury to have that accommodation made by the producers of by Bob and Andrew at Supernatural, as well as by Jeremy, letting me come in on a kind of nearly full-time but kind of part-time basis for the rest of that season. And it was just a blast. I mean, and also in terms of that feeling of authorship, I came in and they had already built the most I don't know what the language restrictions on the podcast are, but like batshit insane.
You can cuss. It's absolutely fine.
The most batshit insane first season of a show I had ever read, or as we were watching cuts come in watch. So it was really wonderful. And it was wonderful to see Jeremy sort of off the chain, because he was writing within a very well established show on Supernatural, and Doom Patrol was so outside the box and so nutty and wild and fun. So I got to just come in and play with those guys, and Shoshana, Chris, the rest, and it was really a complete blast, and I loved it. And I will say I believe I shouldn't admit this, but the butts idea was not my idea. I remember I'd been breaking the story for that episode, and I could tell that Jeremy. It wasn't weird enough. It wasn't wild enough. It didn't have that element that was bringing it all together for Jeremy or for the room. And I was feeling that, and I was like, oh, I'm just too Supernatural or something. I'm not bringing it. And I had to run over to Supernatural and put in a little time there. And I came back into the room at the end of the day, and everyone was just roaring with delight. And it was like, and they're like, we think we have the episode now. And so it still had a lot of pieces that I had developed and that that we had all worked on it together, but the butts came from the room in my absence. And I would say I struggle sometimes, I think all writers do, it's like, well, if it didn't come from me, that it's like I got and this was a case where I was just like, thank you, like give me all the butts. Like I was so delighted, and I thought it was so hilarious and bizarre. And it was a blast to write that episode.
And now the butts has become like an integral part of the show.
I love it.
How often do we get to say, "Oh yeah, the butts are invading"?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Hey, how you doing, but let me whisper in your ear, tell you a little something you might like to hear. What's going on, brothers and sisters? It's your man, Brother Nate from the Lituation Room, as well as the Kings of Sport podcast. And I'm here to tell you about the Multiverse of Color. See, the Showrunner Whisperer is brought to you exclusively by Multiverse of Color. Now, Multiverse of Color is your home for fresh takes on the world of pop culture by established journalists and emerging content creators. It's your one-stop destination for a vast array of articles as well as audio and video productions. Multiverse of Color features exclusive interviews, media event coverage, and film analysis. We talking about all films, all movies out here on these streets, from Hollywood's biggest blockbusters to the most intimate of independent projects. So visit multiverseofcolor.com today, yes, today, right now, for all of the latest stories, and follow Multiverse of Color through the social media links provided in the description below. And now, back to the Showrunner Whisperer.
But let's talk kung fu. Let's talk kung fu, because that is where so much of all your past experience culminated into your co-showrunner with Christina. So let's start just from the basic, like what did that call sound like when you get asked, hey, you wanna co-run this with me?
Well, it was actually a case where I was like, okay, I've done now how many years at the CW? It's time to get into basic cable. It's time to get prestige. It's time to even just go to network. Just change it up. Like, get outside this universe. Supernatural had nearly wrapped, although there was that suspension because of COVID. So this was all during COVID too. It was a very weird time at the beginning of COVID. And my managers got me the script for Kung Fu, and they said, Christina Kim, the creator and showrunner, is looking. I understood it that it was for a number 2 position, basically like a lieutenant co-EP or something, which is its own job, and actually is a job that.
Yeah, feel free to tell viewers, like your listeners, like what is the difference between being a number 1, number 2 on the TV show as in the writer's room.
Yeah, and it can vary from show to show, but there's a lot of democracy in a show where a staff writer is generating ideas at the level of a number 2 or showrunner. There's a lot of like flux, but there is, generally speaking, a showrunner will have someone in a co-executive or even executive producer level who's kind of serving as their point person with the rest of the room, essentially. Like a person, typically someone who can run the room in the showrunner's absence. Usually, but not always, it's the person who's either most experienced in the room, other than the showrunner, or even maybe more experienced than the showrunner, or it's the person in the room who the showrunner just feels has maybe the best handle on what the showrunner will like or dislike. The criteria for it are very varied and fluid, but and so it's a kind of unofficial position. It's not like it's not your title, but it's typically like understood that might be the role you're filling if you're coming into a show, and you would be coming in as a co-EP, and you're the highest person on the on the roster. Like that might be a position you end up doing, and some shows will divvy that function up across multiple upper levels or even mid levels. It can be very fluid, but very often someone will kind of end up sort of embodying the role of the number 2 on a show.
So how let's talk about that first season of being working together with Christina, and again, because you guys because I didn't even know that it was the Kung Fu that had already been like a Kung Fu show back in the 70s, and this was kind of like a more modernization reboot. How did it look like with developing that first season of because this was also a very different show for the CW, dealing with with an Asian-led cast, dealing with with something that already existed before. So how was that working on season 1?
Well, I can say I came in when Christina was, I thought, looking for number 2, as it turns out, looking for a co-showrunner in that first season. The pilot didn't finish shooting. The situation was that show had been developed across many, many seasons. And now I'm going to be telling Christina's story and sort of thumbnail a little bit. The show had gone through many iterations and permutations. And I think the story was that Peter Roth at the studio and Mark Pedowitz at the network were, Kung Fu, the original Kung Fu, was a formative show for both of them. Like they loved it. So there had been an effort across many seasons to try to crack a modernization of this show. Like how do we bring it up to date? How do we make it sort of ready for the CW? And I think a number of scripts were bought. I'm not sure if any actually got shot or not. I don't believe so, but I could be mistaken. And for various reasons, none of those shows got picked up to series. And I think Christina was brought around, and it was like, okay, like it's your turn. You crack it. You make it right for us. And I know that she, at a certain point, I think preceding her, the decision had been made, and maybe all of them, but I believe maybe just the preceding one. It's like, oh, are we going to do it, with like a white guy? Like how about, And I think the idea of having a female-led version of the show had maybe preceded her, but the idea initially was, I think she was working with the studio, and they were sort of, maybe they were steering her, or the show was developing in kind of a more traditional reboot model. And at a certain point, I think she had, and this would be her story to tell, just had a breakdown / breakthrough. Sometimes they come together, where she's like, this isn't working for me. And instead she, just swerved the project and was like, this is going to be, a family story, an all Asian family story, in addition to a story about our hero, sort of, so it would be a hybrid reboot as opposed to a traditional reboot of the show. And ultimately,
reimagining, maybe.
Yes. And I think it was that breakthrough that really shook everything loose. And really from that, like everything that was great about the project really came from, I think, that sort of insights, breakthrough of hers. So I can say that when I came to the show, they had cast the show. They had shot 5 days of the show of the pilot, when COVID struck, and they had to, everyone, flew back to LA, basically it's like everything was completely up in the air. And I know that Christina and Martin Garrow and other folks, they had 4 days of footage, and they just rushed together and just and they even rushed like they had no fight scenes. So on the last day, right before they had to fly back because COVID was descending upon the world, they like quickly, like in front of a bush, just had like, okay, let's just shoot like one little piece of action so that we could cut this together potentially. They cut together a sizzle reel of the show, and really, like, I think it's all just there in the casting and a lot of the creative decisions that had already been made, that it just felt sort of unignorable, I think, to the studio network, that like, okay, if we're going up back into production for just a couple of projects under COVID in this insane time in the world, like the show sort of felt fated, like it had to happen. And I think so much of that comes down to Christina and comes down to the casting of the show. And I would even say in my case, I had some trepidation about going back to the CW, like just in terms of, not having a diverse portfolio, having done sort of episodic genre TV for a long time, like wanting to change, wanting to try something different.
Of course.
And at that point, also, I thought it was just for a number 2 position. If I'd known it was a showrunner, I mean, that's the brass ring, right? I would have grabbed it. So I was kind of like, oh, on the fence. And then I just saw a picture of the cast, and it was just like, you just had a feeling like this is so special, both for the obvious reasons of just, I've never seen, an all Asian network, an all Asian cast on a network show before. But also the character sets and the kinds of relationships that we would get to explore. It felt kind of like, oh, I think I'm going to say yes. And Christina and I were on like a 3rd Zoom, and I was like, God, she's really kicking the tires on me as a number 2. Like we're on our 3rd or 4th Zoom, and she's just like, do you want to do this with me? Like showrun, like be my co-showrunner? And I was like, what? I thought I was just a number 2 job. And so it's very rom-com. I was like, yes, let's do this.
This is very much like a rom-com. I'm loving that.
Yeah. So I was completely flummoxed. I was like, somehow my manager didn't get the memo that this was a showrunning position. But so, I mean, I'd also say that, really in terms of feeling blessed, the work that Christina had already done on assembling the team for the show, both in terms of cast and crew, and it was just such a gift because there was so much there already, and as we, assembled our writing staff and got the first season going, I wasn't starting blind. I also hadn't had I know the experience of network and studio approval for casting can be very fraught. Rewriting a pilot, I was coming in and sort of the cake, at least the cake was kind of baked already. So we got to really hit the ground running and work together. And it was an incredible experience. And we really worked very, very beautifully together. So that was great.
Now I want to talk a little about, because you worked on shows like Supernatural. Now you're working on Kung Fu. You work on Kung Fu. Because social media has always been very interesting to me when it comes to like the way that it may or may not impact a television show. What was like a rule in the writers' room when it came to like what do we look at on social media, like in terms of what fans are responding to, what they're looking to see more of, or like what they may have issues with on the show. Like what did that instrument look like for you guys?
Well, I would say, I mean, our first season, we were straight to series order. So like we weren't finishing a pilot. Like we had to finish out the remainder of the pilot and go straight into shooting the rest of the show. So by the time, my memory could be wrong, but by the time we were airing the first season, we were really deep into the season already.
Yeah.
So in terms of like the tail wagging the dog, there wasn't so much of that on the show. I think we kind of gobbled up virtually any social media response, we could get. And we enjoyed all of the responses. I don't think it ever really steered us one way or the other. But at the same time, I mean, in a subliminal sense, right? Like you internalize everything you read and see. So I can't say that it had no impact at all. I mean, I just remember noticing that, yeah, that the platform really determined the response to a certain extent. Like the way Reddit spoke about our show versus the way Twitter spoke about our show versus the way, Google reviews spoke about our show was extremely varied. Yeah. And I would say like our social media engagement from my perception was quite robust for a new show. But also I was coming off of Supernatural where virtually like there is not a single line in any script I wrote that wasn't getting some like individual conversations going. I mean, Supernatural had the largest social media footprint of like virtually any TV show ever. So, I mean, maybe American Idol at its peak. I don't know. Like, I just don't know what compares to it in terms of social media. So I was like, seems kind of skimpy. And it's like, no, this is good. This is people are watching, people are talking. So, yeah. So it was a pleasure to see people respond to the show.
What is one misconception you think, whether it's viewers or critics, what is one misconception you think they have about showrunners that if you could personally clarify to someone like out on the street, if they came up with you like they shared their thoughts of show running and you heard something like, you know what, I think let's just clear things up here. Like what would that be? I know it's not an easy question at all. Like
there's so many things I could say. I mean, I think the biggest thing is authorship on some level, in that it's so complex. It's like where ideas come from, why stories end up being the stories they are, even why shows end up taking sort of the format that they take. Is there's so many people involved in a show, and a show like the showrunner or showrunners are the eye of the storm and the fulcrum for those final decision makings. And there is a ton of authorship there, but in terms of like where stuff is coming from, you're always getting ideas from all, virtually everyone, who's working on the show in some way or another. You're responding to cast members, feeling like, even if they don't come to you with an issue or whatever, you have your own sort of running dialogue about like, well, it's been a while since we've used, X cast member, we got to give them something juicy here. So there's all this math about, that's determining like, how a story comes about.
Yes, of course.
And then there's the fact of the studio and network, and it's like situations like that where
there's a reason it's called studio notes and network notes.
Yeah. And that, as a showrunner, right? Like this is a sort of sidebar comment, but the best thing about being a showrunner is that you are not being rewritten by other writers. You get to be kind of, I mean, it's a different role, but like head writer in that sense. And when you're coming up on a show, if you're not being rewritten all the time, there's always the chance that you will be. And it can vary from show to show and from script to script. And even in generating ideas for the room, right? You're always pitching, I say pitching upward. It's like you're pitching an idea, but you're pitching with an eye on the showrunner, because they're the ones who are going to decide if it's going to go or if it's not. And when you're a showrunner, you're liberated from that in a sense, because ultimately people are pitching to you and you're pitching back, and ultimately it's your decision. And then on the page, it's like, where that comma lands ends up being your decision. It's going to, this is how I like my, no Oxford commas, or double spaces after periods or no double spaces. Your preference is, you have that control. Funnily, I've only done the job as a co-showrunner with Christina, but we were, as far as that stuff goes, we were so aligned that it really never felt like we were stepping on each other's toes in that regard. But in terms of, there would be no show without the studio, as things are presently structured, and ultimately they're there to support the show. And sometimes their ideas are wrong, and sometimes their ideas are right, but you don't realize they're right until, you get into it. And that process is very, very challenging, but it's a collaboration that spins a show off into other directions. I think even Kung Fu is a case where I think the show we thought we were writing at the beginning of season 1 became something very, very different. And it became very, very different for reasons that were partly independently generated by me and Christina's preference, partly generated by what the cast was bringing, and us trying to steer the ship in a way that was bringing out as much and as varied, material as we could get out of these incredible actors. But some of that was in, difficult first season negotiation with the studio and network. And you're in a position where, if they think you're doing a bad job, or if you're not responding to their concerns about a show, you could be gone, or the show could be gone, right? Mm-hmm. And I think everyone on the show, from us all the way, cast, crew, everyone, and I would include even, the studio and network, like the executives there. The sense that this was the first all Asian network drama, there was a real pressure and intensity, like a real sense of, we don't want to stumble out of the gate. We want to make a great show, but we also want to make a successful show that runs for more than one season. So that was a very, very intense year. And certainly the show just evolves in so many ways. So when you read discourse online, or you read criticism, and they'll put the buck on the showrunner, or they'll put the praise on the showrunner. And it's just it's so much more complicated than that. And so it's you're like, no, that wasn't me. That was actually, one of our writers who came up with that idea, or that was ad-libbed by a cast member, or was inspired by a cast member, or if you're getting knocked up about something, sometimes you're like, well, yeah, I didn't want to do that either, but we kind of had to because of X, Y, and Z, and you don't know X, Y, and Z. There's a very large abstract answer, but it's not a one. The final product is it's kind of the magic of it, right? Is that there's so many false starts and so many other decisions that were made that resulted in the final product, and it comes out feeling like it was born that way, oh, look at my beautiful baby, and you have no idea that it's, the historical memory of its creation, whether you're a writer on the show or an actor on the show, your sense memory of it is just so wildly different, because it includes all of the things that went wrong and all of the things we wanted to do but couldn't do, or the bad idea we had that we were running with that turned out to be a mistake. There's all that stuff is baked into it, and all of that stuff gets obscured when you're just talking about the final product.
What was something you and Christina had to push the hardest for? What was one of the things that you guys again, it's not me trying to make anyone, whether it's on the studio network, look bad or something, but what was a storyline or a character that you guys had to really sit down with them and explain to them, hey, this is crucial to our story, this is crucial for what we are doing with the show, that eventually they came around on?
It's a really good question. There's so many small ones, but I would say ultimately the studio network, the stuff that we were really passionate about, the studio network came, it wasn't generally a battle. It was oftentimes more a case of pitching an idea and it just taking a lot of work to get them to the place where they understood what we were doing, and so sometimes it was a failure of communication on our part, but there were story ideas that worried them. I would say, I mean, one thing that was challenging, and I'll speak out of school a little bit here, is doing comedy episodes for the show. Like, we always felt like the show had a pretty intense Sturm und Drang, like fantasy, action, and family drama side, but we wanted to make sure we were telling a show that was tonally varied, and also we were discovering that our cast was very, very good at the offhand bits of comedy throughout the show. So I think in season 2, and I believe that was Richard Lowe's kernel of an idea he brought to us, and we just were like, we should do a car chase episode. We should do this slightly wackier episode. And I think pitching going wacky on the show, I think, in hearing it, it felt like we were violating what the show was and the seriousness of the show. And it took a lot of persuasion, both with that episode and our subsequent episode, Harmony, that was also a kind of more comedic episode. Those episodes were harder to get across the executive finish line than our typical episodes were, for sure. And ultimately, they ended up loving them and were very supportive, but it just took a longer process to get there.
When one of the things that always stood out with Kung Fu that was so spoken heavily about was the fact that this was one of the few, especially on broadcast network, with Asian American led cast. Throughout your run on the show, like could you feel the responsibility of like, okay, hey, we are now, like, right now one of the few, if not the only, on broadcast that is focusing on this different culture that we don't get to see a lot of, that have sadly been stereotyped a lot in a lot of media? Was that like, could you feel the pressure and responsibility of it as a showrunner leading the show?
Absolutely. It was, that first season was extremely stressful for that reason. And the truth was, in as much as the pilot laid down a lot of tentpoles for what the show was going to be, there was still a really huge open questions about what the show would look like. And so I think it took a season for, everyone to sort of get on the same page. And that process was really, really difficult and really challenging. And I think everyone felt a responsibility to it, and their sense of what was the right way to steer the show, what was the right approach to representation, what was the right tonal mix for the show, even what format the show was, like how much are we going to be telling standalone stories of Nikki sort of, saving a one-off versus a more serialized approach to the show. A lot of that stuff was negotiated across the season and involved a lot of anxiety and stress. And I know the cast felt it too, and I would say what was nice about the second season, and this was an experience I think that the cast all had in, conversations we had with Olivia, that a couple things happened between the first and second season. One, we had told the season that, some people maybe didn't like the show, some people loved it, some people in the middle, right? But it was a season, and it worked. It more or less worked. And ultimately, I think people who stuck it out fell in love with these characters. And so after having a season in the can, there was a sense of we could kind of take a breath and sort of take that burden off ourselves. And I know the cast really felt that burden in season 1, and just were, in some ways, in a very good way. Everyone worked so hard. Everyone was really committed to making the show as good as possible, making it a success. But going into our second season, there was a little bit of, well, now the show is the show. Let's serve the show, and let's take sort of that anxiety about, this responsibility off our shoulders. Now, also, I would say, and again, this is me speaking really more for the experience of the Asian cast members and the Asian writers, and to Christina on the show, like their specific sense of responsibility to this endeavor. But also there was a really, Kung Fu came out sort of, as it came out, there was also kind of a larger watershed happening with Asian American representation in media, and there was a lot of projects starting to happen, and so I think there was also a sense, and it felt like we were the only one, so there was a ton of pressure there. And then we were, by season 2, we were entering a landscape that was diversifying rapidly in front of our eyes. So there was a sense in which we could be a show instead of the show. And some of that pressure we could sort of, dust it off our shoulders a little bit. And I know that was the experience that a lot of the cast felt going into season 2. Let's enjoy ourselves. Let's make Kung Fu Kung Fu.
I want to kind of I know it's been a year now since almost a year now since the end of the show. I've always been curious because I talked to different people who worked on CW shows and just asking for their perspective. Like, when did you guys get a wind of that there was massive restructuring going on, and how did that go? Did that happen before you guys started developing season 3, or did it happen in the middle of season 3 where you had to be like, shit, we need to kind of have some backup plans here?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in sort of the larger sense of the industry, that the business model of the CW is in trouble, even, and then I think that sense was sort of hovering, even early in season 2. And by the time we wrapped season 2, we knew that things were changing really rapidly and dramatically. And as a result, we went into season 3 not prepared to end the show, but certainly trying to develop a season 3 that could work as a endpoint for the show, so that we didn't leave viewers hanging, and that we told sort of a complete chapter in those 3 seasons.
If you don't mind me asking, like, if the show had come back, because this is, again, for the passion kung fu viewers out there, like, what can you share anything what season 4 was going to be?
So while we were breaking season 3 with all the writers and me and Christina, we were looking for closure and full circle with the pilot in a way that would feel very contained. But we had a ton of ideas for where we would go in the event of a season 4. And the idea was to basically reboot the show. Like, it would feel like a new beginning, a new chapter for the show. How much can I tease? I mean, I think the idea is, we left Nikki recognizing that she had healed her relationship with her family, but that she still had an appetite and a taste for seeing the larger world that she hadn't satisfied, and that her development lay outside of San Francisco. And so, in sort of that full circle back to the original show, probably our most overt callback to the show from the 70s, she sort of walks off into the sunset. And the idea would be that we would have picked up with a 2 or 3 year jump. Nikki is out in the world.
I don't want to get you in trouble, so only say how much ever you feel comfortable. Because that was interesting. You're doing a time jump, like, because usually a lot of shows, they don't do time jump until like by season 5, but you guys would do like right after season 3. That's interesting.
It would have been earlier, yeah. And the idea would have been establishing Nikki as an itinerant who basically is living out a modern version of the original series. The idea was almost that what we were watching was a prelude to a traditional reboot of Kung Fu, so that she's walking the earth, going from city to city and helping people wherever she goes, with a sort of spidey sense for people who needed her. And then the 4th season premiere would have established her in South Korea, working a job just to get some pin money. Seeing that she's still in touch with her family, we would have gotten little glimpses of where everyone was at back in San Francisco. And she ends up getting involved in a one-off plot that kind of ends up bringing her back to San Francisco. So it would have been sort of an opportunity to establish her in a new environment, evolve and mature her, across 3, unseen seasons of the show, this kind of interregnum, and then reconstituting kind of the family, so that she ends up back in San Francisco and ends up sort of getting the team back together. And that's a little generic. I feel like some of the details I would want to talk with Christina first before I spill.
No, of course. Well, maybe you'll, listen, I'm more than happy to have you back at some point, and we can dish it all out. But before I wrap this up, what are you working on next? I know you said that this year has started off a little slow, but like, what can you tease about your next chapter of your career?
I don't know that anything I'm working on now will ever see the light of day, but I'm working.
Don't be so harsh. You never say never. Yeah, you only thought that number 2 that Showrunner game was just a number 2 gig.
Yeah, I'm working on a horror feature, and I'm working on a couple pilots at the moment. while also being available for any job someone wants to send my way in the meantime. So yeah, I'm looking for work, and still enjoying my present sleep schedule at the moment.
We do love a good sleep schedule.
Yes.
But Bob, it's been amazing hearing your journey and your experience, and I cannot wait to see what's next for you. So I'm hoping we can, I will follow you where you ever you go, and I will of course have you on again. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience as a showrunner, and for that, 'cause who knows, maybe because you were talking about like how you worked in a show where a lot of writers would go on to become showrunners. There could be a listener out there right now when this episode comes out that will maybe be the next showrunner, and you're like, I heard Bob's story on the Showrunner Whisperer.
Uh-huh. I love that. And I've had a great time. Thank you. Great hosting, Andy. I'll come back anytime.
Oh, thank you. And welcome back. That was my chat with Bob Berens of Kung Fu. And first of all, once again, Bob, if you're listening, thank you so much for being one of the earliest guests to come on and support the podcast when we hadn't even announced it yet. It was definitely crazy to are able to book people's that early, and your story was incredible to hear, and I cannot wait to see where you go next. So guys, yeah, so if you enjoy what you heard, and look forward to more episodes like this in the coming weeks and months. But yeah, that's gonna basically be it. So we're gonna do, as always, our wrap up plugs. So first of all, if you want to follow the Showrunner Whisperer and Multiverse of Color through Twitter, you can do it on Twitter at Showrunner Talk and at Multiverse of Color, because Elon just doesn't want me to have off in the handle, I guess. On Instagram, we're at Showrunner Whisperer and at the Multiverse of Color, which is also the same case for Threads. For people who don't know, Threads is associated with Instagram. And we're also on Facebook at Showrunner Whisperer and at Multiverse of Color. And we're also on TikTok at Showrunner Whisperer and at Multiverse of Color. So go check us out on all those platforms. And you can find me at Andy Behbakht all over social media. And you can also find me on Twitch, Kick, and YouTube, where I stream my gaming. Not great gaming, but it's gaming, at least. I'm also a senior writer and interviewer for ScreenRant.com. So get all your latest news on superheroes and TV shows, movies, and so much more, and interviews at ScreenRant.com. I'm also the editor-in-chief of Multiverse of Color, which is the place that is bringing you the Showrunner Whisperer as our first original podcast. And yeah, I like all the notes, all the links to where you can find the podcast, where you can find me at, where you can find the podcast at, is in the show notes, as well as in the video description if you're watching this on YouTube, which you subscribe to that YouTube channel, because we're almost at 300 subscribers on Multiverse of Color, which, it would be great to hit that goal before we get to July. So yeah, but yeah, that's going to be it. That's it for June. That is it for Showrunner Whisperer of June. We will be back in July, which will most likely be at least two of the episodes will be a two-parter with one of the showrunners, so you will have to just wait and see. But yeah, we have lots of more conversations coming up with amazing showrunners and their journeys and what they went through of running a television show in Hollywood. So, but once again, thank you all so much for listening and supporting the show. And like I said, if you could just take a minute of your time, go to Apple Podcasts, hit that subscribe button, and also leave us some 5-star reviews, which would help us tremendously. That's like, again, I'm not asking for money. I'm not asking for anything. I just ask you to take maybe 3 minutes of your time, go on your Apple Podcasts app or iTunes, wherever you are, look up Showrunner Whisperer, subscribe, and just hit that 5-star review, because that's a great way for other listeners who may not use social media to discover the podcast. The more reviews and ratings we have, the higher we will get on Apple Podcast Store, as well as other platforms where you can get your podcasts at. So that's it. That's basically it. But for my entire team here on the Showrunner Whisperer, for Julian Bell, Mike Schmidt, and Nate Milton, who are my saving warriors as part of our media team, I'm Andy Behbakht, and I will see you next time on the Showrunner Whisperer.